Hello, my name is Brian Cam, and I am an independent researcher, writer, occasional podcaster working on ideas to do, well, really the history of ideas, the history of epistemology, how we know things, and many other histories besides, like history proper and things like that. Now, I am just getting set up here, so I will post in the show notes the point at which I start the lecture, if that is what it is, proper, in case you want to stop me from rambling on. Okay. So lately, I think I'm ready to more or less go at the moment. Lately, I have been working on two strands that I think are related, and I don't exactly know how they're related, but they are to do with Nietzsche's will to power and his conception of selfhood, or rather the lack of a conception of selfhood in that work. And that's using this really impressive, just really, really brilliant paper by J. Hillis Miller from 1981. And I will post that in the show notes, because if you want to read this paper, I would absolutely love to have someone read this with me, because I just think it's so important. And so what Nietzsche is doing in it is kind of unpicking or undoing the strands of selfhood. And that relates to something that David Hume did. It's called the kind of bundled view of the self. I always get it confused because David Hume was writing two things, and I always forget which one's the longer one and which one's the shorter one. Basically, he did this long work that he thought was brilliant, and then it got like no traction, and so he kind of had to do a cut version. And so the first one, I think, yes, I'm pretty sure, was called Treatise of Human Nature in 1739. And that's the one that he thinks is really good. And then 9 years later, in 1748, I get the impression it's because no one really read the Treatise of Human Nature that he becomes famous later on for, I don't know if he becomes famous, but anyway, he tried to write a shorter, more polemical book, and that's called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding in 1748. And they contain some of the same materials, but as I said, the later one is shorter, and he gets kind of famous on the basis of that one. Now, in this case, the difference does matter, because the bundle view of the self, I believe, only exists in the Treatise of Human Nature, the longer work that he did in 1739. And it's taken out of An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Now, I actually have no idea whether, like, the degree to which Nietzsche read Hume, and I haven't really told you what Hume is working on yet. But Schopenhauer for sure read this work by Hume. Schopenhauer thinks you need to read like all of philosophy before you can understand philosophy. And he may be right. I don't know. He's very much a completionist, as a friend of mine said, when it comes to reading philosophy. So what is the bundle view of the self? It's basically saying something like the self can only arise when you're conscious. And so you have to be conscious of something to be conscious, in Hume's view. And in most modern, like sort of cognitive scientists, neuroscientists' view, I would like to question that at some point. But and I think Buddhism has an idea that it might be possible to be conscious without any object of consciousness. At the same, some things that I've read about Buddhism make me think that is possible, and other ones make me think no, maybe you do need an object of consciousness in order to be conscious. But let's just assume that for now, that in order, for Hume, it's like if you're in a deep dreamless sleep and you're not having any experience, you can't have an experience of selfhood. You basically it just lights out when you're under anesthesia or you're in deep sleep. I don't know what kind of anesthesia they would have had then. Maybe they had ether or something. Let's not get into that. Hume basically thinks the self arises in conjunction with some other. The self arises in conjunction with the experience that it's having. And because the experience that you're having is always changing, right? We never have the same experience twice, even if we read the same book or, look at the same picture or whatever, read the same blog post, listen to the same song, even immediately after we've done it, we are already a kind of different person by the time we do that. And if that sounds familiar, that's kind of an idea that would probably be found in Heraclitus, this idea that you never step in the same river twice, and that's because the river is always flowing and changing. Some people add to that, I don't think it's in the Heraclitus fragment, but I could be wrong, that you're not the same person. So basically, everything's always in flux. Now, this may just sound like a kind of philosophical nonsense, but what Hume is saying is that if the self is dependent on experience to exist, and experience is always changing, then the self must always be changing. And it does raise kind of interesting questions about, like, is the person, like, is the self that runs and motivates itself to run, like when I'm running, the same one that does the reading? Or are they in some way kind of different, and maybe they arise, like there are patterns clearly, right? Because otherwise we wouldn't have this idea that there is a self. Now, Hume has this bundle view, right? Now, Nietzsche has so this is like much later. So just to recap, Hume's writing in 1739. He has what some would even call like a Buddhist view, which is that the self arises only in conjunction with certain sense experiences. And I'm also going to link you in the show notes to Alison Gopnik's article on this topic, because that is, it basically, she enters the question whether Hume would have had access to the Buddhist texts. If he did, and it looks like he might possibly have done, then he was one of the first Westerners to actually encounter Buddhism, I guess. And so this is in the 30s. Now, Nietzsche often refers to Buddhism as a kind of, he doesn't like it typically when he's referring to it. He basically just says, he thinks of it in terms of this destruction of desire thing, and therefore it's opposed to living life, living a kind of vivacious, embodied, exuberant life that he seems to always sort of wish for, but never really attain. So Nietzsche's Will to Power in 1888 does a lot of looking at the self in great detail and kind of picks it apart, basically. So there's this great piece that I mentioned at the start called The Disarticulation of the Self in Nietzsche. And I came to it, I think I talked about this last time, through Gemes or whatever his name is, Gemes. And he was writing on postmodernism's use and abuse of Nietzsche, which is a joke on Nietzsche's own article. Is it an article? I don't know. Anyway, on the use and abuse of history for life from 1876. So Gemes is saying, yeah, postmodernism uses and abuses Nietzsche. And I think that's basically right. Like, Nietzsche in these terms is thought to be, many people think of him either as a nihilist, which he vehemently argues against. He is really opposed to nihilism. And many others think that he's a relativist. And I think both of these are wrong. It's like he challenges conceptual notions, and then people are like, well, if concepts don't mean anything, then nothing means anything. And they jump straight to this kind of, well, everything's just equal. And, this is just pure relativism, and it means that there is no truth. And I don't think Nietzsche would agree to that. I think Nietzsche would basically say, no, there are things, there are better and worse ways of doing things. It's just that concepts don't really necessarily relate that strongly to those lived things. Now, this kind of brings me on to today, what I want to talk about today, because I got very excited about this morning. So maybe I'll just say the other side of this coin that I'm looking at with Nietzsche, which is the question of Buddhist dependent origination. I think I'm just going to mention that that's a thing that I'm working on through Lee Browsington's book, which I will also link, and also through this other guy, Buddhadasa Bodhi. I think he gave a series of lectures in the 70s, and they seem to have, I don't know if they've been retranslated or republished, but in the last year or two, they seem to be out again. And I will link those as well. It's very readable. I was very excited to find. So both of these books are free. Lee Browsington's book, which I think came out a year or two ago, on dependent origination, and Buddhadasa's lectures, and they're short and they're very readable, which is great because on the one hand, the Buddha quite often reiterates how important dependent origination is, and most people find it totally impenetrable. If you have ever heard of it, it's this 12-step thing that ends with birth and death, and it has, dukkha, like it has suffering and craving and clinging and craving, and Vedana, like feeling tone, and sense, what is it before feeling tone? Contact, consciousness, sense perception, these Sankara fabrications. And so you probably look at this and you're like, what the hell is this? It's just like this very, very complicated, arcane seeming 12 steps. And are they talking about cosmology? Are they talking about the life of an individual? Like, are they talking about the creation of the universe is what I mean? And some readings seem to suggest that, because a lot of the terminology that is used in this 12-step version is also used in the Vedas as part of a description of cosmology. Then there's another reading where maybe it's like the life of an individual, and you go through this, you're born into ignorance, because ignorance is step one, and then you kind of go through all these other stages, and then it culminates. But the weird thing is, like, birth and death are right at the end, so it's like, how does ignorance lead on to craving, and then you're only born in the 11th step? There's all kinds of like confusing things about that. Now, what's coming out now in Browsington's book, I just did a session with him through the London Insight Center a few weeks ago, and he talked about dependent origination, and his book is also just fantastic. He thinks it's a moment-to-moment understanding of dependent origination. So something like, in this case, you start kind of at this point of ignorance. And by the way, like, although it is useful to kind of think through what these links might be, for Browsington, they're not causal links. So it's not that, contact causes Vedana, which is like a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. It's that Vedana, which is a pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, response, can't occur without consciousness. So it's basically a dependency relationship rather than a causal relationship. So you could imagine, I'm trying to think of like what a good example of this would be, just any dependency, right? Like let's just talk about extinction. Like, and a species can't go extinct unless it exists, right? And so, like, that would be a dependency, but there's not necessarily, it would be wrong to say that existence causes extinction. And you could think about this in terms of birth and death, right? Like, in order for something to die, in order for a human to die, he or she must have been born. And yet it would be kind of wrong to say that birth causes death. It's like a dependency kind of thing. And so most people look at the links of dependent origination and they think of it as a causal, serial chain. In fact, it's much more complicated in some ways, in the sense that there are multiple dependencies going in different directions. And it's much simpler in another way, which is that you don't actually have to understand. You can basically, if you pick apart enough of these dependencies, the whole thing collapses. And the reason you want this to happen is because the end of dependent origination on the moment by moment view, not the 2-life view or the 3-life view or the cosmological view, but just like maybe this is what's happening all the time kind of view. The end is dukkha, is suffering, and suffering, old age, and death. And you think, okay, so and the Buddha always says, I only teach dukkha and the end of dukkha, right? And if you don't know what dukkha is, it's suffering or unsatisfactoriness, or Lee Brasington tries to describe it as a bummer, which is basically encompasses everything from like mild negativity to very, very deep negativity. As in, someone ate my sandwich, bummer, which is dukkha, versus like, a genocide occurred, also bummer, dukkha. And it's not that they're equivalent necessarily, but sorry, but that they all fit under this Buddhist heading of dukkha. So one way of interrupting dukkha, like basically the point is that if you think enough about these dependency relationships, you can just break one of the dependencies and it doesn't matter which one. And so at the end of that, then you end suffering. So in other words, the point is not to make an assertion of philosophical truth. It's not to make a metaphysical claim. It's not to make you must memorize these 12 steps because this is how I'm saying this is how it works. It's kind of more like a, hey, notice that you can't suffer unless you wanted things. And in this case, the second arrow kind of suffering, like you can't experience non-acceptance if you accept everything. That would be one way of breaking the chain. There's other, so like, and I think this is important. This is going to relate to what I'm about to talk about today, which is that the end result of what the Buddha's teaching is methodological. It's actually not an assertion of the way things are. It's more like an investigation to see if this is not how things work. So the invitation is always, see if this is not true, not I assert that this is true and I want to enter an argument. He often refuses to enter arguments about things like the existence of the self. So in one of these dependent origination conversations, which I'm not going to remember, they're always MN, or there's all these old suttas, and some of them are very, very old, like probably very, very start of Buddhism, and some are newer. But in one of them, a guy comes to the Buddha and says, like, is there a self? And the Buddha refuses to answer. And the same guy is like, is there not a self? And he also refuses to answer. And then afterwards, he explains, I think, to Ananda, that if he were to say that there is a self, this guy would eternalize that concept and basically fixate on the idea of self. And if he were to deny that there was a self, then that would cause nihilism, which is basically that person to think there is no self. Now, the reason this is important is that, well, Brasington makes the claim that the Buddha never asserts that there is not a self. What he says is that anywhere you look, you can't find the self, which is not the same thing as denying its existence. So, in other words, however it comes, this illusion of self comes about, like the harder you look, the more it has a tendency to disappear. And this is what Hume and what Nietzsche are doing, in my view. And that's why I kind of want to know whether Nietzsche would have had access to any of the Buddhist stuff. As I said, Nietzsche is very kind of insulting about the Buddha, but he's also very insulting about Darwin. He's like, I think it might be Will Durant who says he's most insulting about the people who most influenced him. And maybe we're all a bit like that. I'm not sure. So that's a kind of preview of what I'm working on. I talked a little bit about that last week. So this is Hillis Miller's Disarticulation of the Self, which I'll link. Gopnik's article on whether Hume could have read Buddhist texts. Then there's the question of whether Nietzsche could have read Hume. And then there's Brasington's book on dependent origination. I'm being told I look like a discounted Chris Hemsworth. I guess I'll take that as a compliment instead of an insult. I'm not. I'm just stuck in philosophy here. I'm only doing suffering and the end of suffering, like the Buddha. So the next thing I want to talk about is just this question of methodology. Now, this is, I'm going to have to go through let's see. I'm going to have to go through what I was looking at this morning. So I was first looking at Socrates. And if you've heard me talk about this before, you may know that I'm not always a fan of Socrates' methodology. He, he's sort of well known for doing this questioning thing, which is the Socratic method. And it's thought to be that he's aiming to get at truth. And I think that is a good description, actually. So he seems to presuppose that there is an objective, kind of consistent conceptual answer to what a concept is. So he's going to ask about piety or virtue or something like that. And he goes into each conversation assuming that there will be a kind of abstract truth. He's not very interested in experience. He's interested in getting concepts like aligned. And that is what Western philosophy ends up doing for sort of at least 2 millennia, probably slightly more, after the death of Socrates, which is in, I think, 399 BC. So the way I came across that was it was actually a Philosophize This episode, the podcast, and I can link that too, actually, because that might be interesting to you. And that one, okay, so that was on William James, the American psychologist and philosopher from the late 19th century. And James, as I kind of said, Socrates has this massive impact. Well, whether he has this massive impact or whether later generations want to select him as the start of this whole project is its own debate. But he really wants to get concepts straight. That's like his big thing. Now, and as I said, that remains the project of philosophy until at least the 17th century, and probably it doesn't really start to fall apart in any serious way until the 19th century in what we will call the West. And the end of this becomes sort of clearer within people that are called pragmatists. And so there are pragmatists right from the beginning, pretty much from ancient Greece and certainly in the East. So I would say, I would argue that the Taoists, especially Zhuangzi in China, are pragmatist philosophers. I would also argue that the Buddha is a pragmatist philosopher, which is that they're not so interested in getting philosophical concepts correct. And this sometimes leads to the accusation. Actually, I won't get into this, but there are some people who say, oh yeah, philosophy is only this thing that comes out of ancient Greece, and therefore we can assert that China doesn't have a philosophy because it has thought, but not philosophy. I really hate this argument. I just think it's like anyway, I'm not going to get into it. But what we call Western philosophy, this thing that goes from kind of, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and goes maybe through these Stoics and maybe goes through these medieval scholastics, and it winds up in these German idealists in Kant. First of all, that story is a story that starts around the time of Kant. Some of Kant's followers want to put these all in a row, and we still just assume that this is kind of the case, and which is weird because there are these big gaps in that story, particularly in the Middle Ages, where there's a kind of gap between like Augustine in like the 4th century and like, I don't know, Thomas Aquinas or something like that, like almost 1,000 years later. So why am I talking about these concepts? William James is a psychologist and philosopher, brother of Henry James, the author, and the novelist, storyteller. And William James is kind of the father of modern psychology. He predates, actually, I was going to say he predates Freud, but does he actually, when is he born? He feels earlier in my head, but he might not actually be earlier. Okay, 1842, yeah. So Freud's born in 1856. And Nietzsche's born in 1844, I think. So, but James dies in 1910, whereas Freud dies in 1939, which I think is partly why it feels like Freud must be later. So James, influenced by John Dewey, well, okay, I'm not being very clear here. James, Dewey, and Peirce are known as the American pragmatist philosophers. And what they believe is that the convergence theory of truth, or it's called the correspondence theory of truth, which is that out there is reality, then, in our minds and in our speech are concepts. And the job of philosophy is to get those concepts to match up with what's out there. So if that's the case, then language matters a lot, and language is kind of reliable. We can assume that it matches up to reality. And this is certainly what Socrates is doing, even with very abstract nouns like justice or, piety or virtue. I'm just making those up. I'm not even sure if those are the ones he cares about, because I've only read a couple of Plato's dialogues. So many other periods of thought don't really assume this correspondence theory of truth. And those are the ones that I'm interested in. And so William James is one of these. And in this podcast, that it's a Philosophize This that Stephen West did, and I will link it in the show notes. William James is going against this Socratic tendency. So Socrates is always saying, what is truth? And he's always asking this series of questions, pre-assuming before he enters any dialogue, that truth is something that exists, that's consistent, and that you can kind of investigate as if it were a sort of object, right? And William James is known for this completely opposite view, a pragmatist theory of truth, which is like truth is what works in the world. So it's kind of practical application. And other pragmatists, philosophers, even contemporaries of James, do not like this formulation. They want there to be, so I kind of made a mistake and said convergence theory of truth. That's Charles Sanders Peirce's view, which is that although truth is not this abstract conceptual thing, it has to exist in the world, it will converge into one thing. Like it will converge into one best description. Whereas James's view is that it doesn't necessarily need to do that. Like different cultures might end up with different truths. And this is the kind of thing that most Western philosophers don't like the sound of, because it seems to be going towards relativism. Now, what was I working on this morning? That's kind of hard to describe. So basically, I was searching the Loeb classics for Socrates' assumption that concepts will be consistent. And I couldn't find, actually, there's these green Loeb classics. I've got some here that they're just philosophy books, and they're great because they have ancient Greek on one side and then they have English on the other side. And I don't I learned the Greek alphabet just to kind of like search for individual words, but I'm certainly don't read ancient Greek, but it is still nice to have that there because you can then use that to help you find other translations and things like that of passages that I need to look at. And so one of the Loeb classics, one of the introductions to one of Plato's dialogues, talked at length about, not at length, but it just talked about how Socrates goes into every conversation with the assumption that there will be a consistent truth at the end. And that's what I was looking at today, because I think what Socrates is doing to some degree is what I would call defamiliarization. There's a Russian formalist critic called Viktor Shklovsky that I've written about, and I will link to a bit about him. I think I did a thread on Twitter about him. And he talks about this concept of that the point of art is to defamiliarize or take the familiar and make it unfamiliar. Now, Socrates is kind of doing this. Like he sometimes leaves these dialogues in very unsatisfactory points. And of course, you can't really attribute this directly to Socrates because what we have is Plato's written down version of what Socrates was saying. So the Hippias Minor would be an example where at the end of it, he seems to like he hasn't exactly like won the argument, but he's like confused the other guy that he's talking to. And then it kind of ends in this like state of like open-ended confusion, basically. And so that's actually led some people to think that the Hippias Minor is actually like a parody of a real Platonic dialogue, because it's almost like shows that the Socratic method does not actually work to uncover truth, because at the end of it, it's almost like Socrates and the guy that he was asking, and I think they're talking about the Odyssey actually, and they're talking about Odysseus and whether it's something to do with this polytropoi word, I think. So it's basically like about his wiliness. Like, is it good or is it bad? Is it honest or dishonest or something like that? And so the Hippias Minor is an example of a failure. Depending on what you think the Socratic method should do, you might well come to the conclusion that it kind of fails. It's this, like, what was the point of a discussion where at the end of it, no one's agreed on anything, no one has any clarity, and in fact, people who thought they knew something going into the discussion now feel that they don't. Now, I want to kind of say that this is why I'm opposed to Socrates' method, and this is going to jump straight to Heidegger. So basically, if you and I are having a conversation about the concept I always use is capitalism, because it seems to refer to a bunch of different things. Like, I might say, I'm pro-capitalist, and what I mean is that I'm in favor of like the market economy. And you say, I'm anti-capitalist. And what you mean is you're opposed to profits going to the owners of capital rather than to the workers, for example. Because you could imagine a system where a market economy operates, but instead of owners of capital receiving profits, workers receive profits. And that's an idea that could happen. But basically, what I'm saying is we both understood a different thing by the word capitalism. And so when that comes into conflict, you have a problem, and you are going to have to break down the conversation and say, okay, let's step back. Let's go back to definitions. And I think this is the move that Socrates is doing, right? Because he's kind of stepping back and saying, what does truth mean? And he thinks that if we can just nail that down, then we'll have a better, or what does virtue mean? Or what does piety mean? And then we'll be able to nail this down and say, now we all agree on what piety is, and that will solve societal problems. What I'm trying to suggest is that this move, although it's necessary at times, of stepping back and saying, what is it? This is what he's always asking, TSD, I think it is in Greek. Like, what is it? It's necessary sometimes, but it's actually like a really bad idea at other times. So, and this is what takes us to Heidegger. So in Being in Time, he talks about this concept. And by the way, I'm not a Heidegger kind of person either, although I was helping my partner. She wrote a paper on Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, which I have not read, but that will hopefully be posted soon. And the section that I'm talking about is in Heidegger's Being in Time from 1927. and which I also don't know super well. But basically, the idea is that with certain tools, when they're functional, are ready at hand. So when you walk into a room and want light in the room, the switch allows you to produce light, and it allows you to do so transparently, basically. So you walk into the room, you flip the switch, the light's on. You don't really think too much about the switch. In fact, in most cases, you probably don't think about the switch at all, right? You just walk in and there's a kind of transparent expression of your, and you may not even be conscious, like let's say you're coming into your house and you just do it automatically. So it's completely on autopilot. And that is what Heidegger would call ready to hand. So basically the tool is ready to hand, it's ready to be used, it's ready to have your will expressed through it. Let's say you've got a full glass of water, that's a familiar glass to you in front of you, and you have thirst. It may be that as you're working away or whatever, you just pick up the glass of water, you drink the water, and there's no secondary thought about where did this glass come from or anything like that. And so, in other words, the tool is ready to hand, you pick it up, and you express your will directly through it. Now, the other mode is what Heidegger calls present at hand. And so that's when something has gone wrong, right? So you turn on, you get home, you flip the switch on the light, and nothing comes on. You're like, okay, well, what's going on now? And that draws attention to the switch, right? Or you pick up your glass as you're working away, and the glass is empty. You're like, oh, now I have to do something else other than just express my will through it. Now, what I want to say is that this is also true of language. So language is a set of tools where every word is a tool. And if it's functioning, we don't really need to have we don't need to actually be even able even to say the definitions. Definitions are quite hard. So sometimes you have to step back and say, okay, it sounds like when you're talking about, whenever you say you're in, whenever I say I'm in favor of capitalism, I'm talking about the market. And whenever you talk about capitalism, you're talking about the workers. And so maybe there's something and then we have to do this step back, right? And that's sometimes necessary, but I want to argue that most times you shouldn't do that. So basically, I just said the word basically. If we go in and start saying, what is the etymology of the word basic? And, where does this all come from? And what is the underlying metaphor from that word? That's kind of doesn't allow me to continue with my sentence, right? And this is why Socrates kind of bothers me, because he comes into conversations where people are actually having a functional conversation about how cool Odysseus is or whatever. And then he kind of messes that up by saying, well, what do you mean he's a good person or something like that? And the people are like, that's not what we're doing, dude. And so, and he is annoying, from the beginning, he's considered annoying. Of course, he's in some argument killed for being annoying. He's, people call him the gadfly and things like that. He says that he's moved by his daemon, which is a kind of minor god. He refuses to acknowledge the Athenian gods, but he says, my daemon makes me do this thing of trying to get at the truth. And hang on a second. Sorry, just a bit of noise outside. That may be true, that he clearly feels a compulsion to think about things at this abstract level, this very, very abstract level of what is truth kind of level. So what I'm kind of arguing is that combining Heidegger and Shklovsky, which I know I'm going all over the place. What Socrates is doing in most of these cases is calling attention to the terminology and saying, well, why don't we talk about the terminology instead? And again, that's a perfectly necessary thing to do in some situations, but it's also just very annoying, right? Which is that if I am constantly saying, well, what do you mean by this word that you said and used transparently? It's a little bit we're trying to do a job. Let's say we're trying to build a house, and we've each got hammers and nails or whatever. I've never built a house, so I'm just going to make this up. And I'm like, okay, what we need to do is like nail this wood into this other wood. Here's a hammer. And you're like, rather than like pick up the hammer and like help me, you're like, where do hammers come from anyway? And like, you just start staring at the hammer. That's like a perfect example of both what Shklovsky would call ostranenie, the defamiliarization. The familiar object, which is just the tool that we were happily, banging nails in with a minute ago, has now become this object of scientific investigation. And scientific, I think, is important because this switch from ready at hand, where it's just kind of out there and we use it transparently, to present at hand, where you inspect the object itself, is the scientific mode, right? It's also the philosophical mode. And these things are linked, I think. Now, where am I going with this? So, and I will get to the chat. I've seen that there's some things in the chat, but I want to get to the end of this stream of thought, and then I will look at questions or comments. So, truth seems to me to be the kind of central problem, which is this idea that you have this thing that's true of something, which is like solid. It's like an adjective, right? In English, and I think in some other languages, but I'll just speak for English right now. And I've said this before. True is a word related to tree, and it means solid or like steadfast, something you can lean on, something you can rely on. So true must be, and etymologically this is true as well, which is that the idea of true as an adjective comes before truth as a noun. So truth as a noun comes from this process of abstracting away from, this is like a solid thing that you can like lean your hand on, or, lean against a tree kind of thing. Like, and true as steadfast, there are other times we use true to mean something more like that rather than logical propositional truth. So there's this argument that Chinese philosophy, up until a certain point, and this is an argument going back decades, that Chinese philosophy doesn't really have a concept of truth until quite late. And that seems interesting to us because we seem to always assume that there is some kind of standard, objective, like single truth a lot of times. And this is a kind of legacy of a way of thinking in Socratic terms. And so I want to combine that with the idea that wouldn't it be interesting if adjectives as a part of speech preceded nouns, right? So you're basically saying, and I think it can't really be that simple. Like there must be tree, like, okay, that's a bad example. So in this case, probably tree precedes true. So basically you've got this idea of an objective tree, which is the noun, I guess, a concrete noun. Then from that, you get an adjective, which is true, which is like tree-like. It's basically something you can lean on. Then from that, you go back to a noun with this abstract truth. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe concrete nouns predate adjectives and adjectives predate abstract nouns. The reason I'm kind of thinking in these terms, Julian Jaynes also thinks that he thinks the first words are commands. And which is interesting. You could also think maybe it's warnings, because I think other primates will will make certain noises when they see certain predators or something like that. So is that a command like hide, or is that a warning like hawk or something like that, or eagle or whatever is big enough to harm a primate? Jaynes thinks that the first words are commands, and there's something like sharper. And so you're making a tool and you're doing this thing, and I'm saying sharper. Now, this is a very weird kind of thought experiment. Actually, is that right? So he's talking about, I'm just looking at, this is his book, pretty much his only book as far as I know, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. from 1976. Okay, so he actually thinks danger calls are first. And then there's vocal qualifiers that precede the invention of nouns, which they modified rather than the reverse. His argument is just amazing. The age of modifiers perhaps lasted up until 40,000 BC, where we find archaeologically retouched hands and hand axes and points. And then he thinks that there's an explosion of different tool types between 40,000 and 25,000 BC, and that this probably relates to an explosion in language as well. And if we're going on the assumption, which is the assumption of sort of newer forms of cultural evolution, then language itself is a form of technology and maybe one of the earliest forms of technology. So this is about thinking in adjectives, not in nouns. And so basically, let me see what I wrote about that this morning. Yes. Yeah, this is actually from the one that I know I'm going all over the place. This is a very early draft of this thinking. Like, it's literally stuff that I'm thinking about today. So I'm going back to Stephen West on William James, and he's talking about Socrates, and he's saying, actually, it's kind of an interesting claim, which is that Stephen West thinks what we're left with after all these years having conversations is not, we don't tend to use abstract words like beauty as much, he doesn't think. We're more likely to say beautiful, which is, as I was saying, is probably the earlier word. And it's true that we don't, like things like honor, virtue, like those words may have been at one point, I mean, they certainly were very, very important for much of, the history of the West, but you don't really hear appeals to, it would even be weird to say, like, for me to say, even though this is to some degree true, that like I have a commitment to beauty or a commitment to, like, aesthetics, maybe I could say, but like, I devote my life to honor or something like that. Sounds pretty weird, right? So I think West kind of has a point, which is that before a certain point, or maybe for a very long time indeed, maybe for a few thousand years, these abstract nouns were thought to be pretty objective. And maybe this does start to fall apart in the 17th to 19th century, as I was saying at the start. Now, I'm just going to say where this is all going, even though this is an extremely early stage draft, and you may not have been able to follow anything that I'm saying at the moment. I'm going to go to the Buddha's raft parable, which is also something that Wittgenstein kind of channels at the end of the Tractatus. And this is just the idea that the Dhamma is like a raft. So basically, the way, because I think Dhamma is related to the word Tao, the kind of way out of suffering, or the way we're going to use to get out of this issue of suffering, is like a raft, in that you kind of string it all together and you use it to get across the river. But once you've got across the river, like once you've solved this particular problem, let's say you needed to get across the river, you don't carry around the raft for the rest of your life. And what I'm starting to think, and there's a few other examples. So Wittgenstein, I think, makes reference to this in a weird way. I need to think about Nietzsche's idea that we are going off to the open sea. But the other person that is worth thinking about, at least on this topic, is Neurath, Otto Neurath, who in 1921, in an essay called Anti-Spengler, describes philosophy like this: we are like sailors who on the open sea must reconstruct their ship, but are never able to start afresh from the bottom. Where a beam is taken away, a new one must at once be put there. And for this, the rest of the ship is used as support. In this way, by using the old beams and driftwood, the ship can be shaped entirely anew, but only by gradual reconstruction. And so this relates both to the Buddha's kind of parable, which is that philosophy, or specifically like the Dhamma, as a practical philosophy, a practical way out of suffering, is stitched together from these kind of concepts that you need to use to get across the river, but you don't want to carry it around for the rest of your life. And he's very critic. He says that dependent origination is like this. This is non-foundationalist, is one way of saying it, as opposed to Cartesian foundationalism. So Descartes' project is to stabilize things. You might also, I don't think anyone else on earth would think of this, maybe, but there are two strands of philosophy in India, and those are called, damn it, now I'm going to forget the term. I'm going to look it up, and it won't take long, I promise. It's Astika and Nastika. So it didn't actually come up. I looked at Jainism in my Zettelkasten, and I should have looked at Charvaka. Anyway, Astika says we take the Vedas as authoritative. So basically, they're interested in questions of authority. Nastika philosophies, which include Buddhism, Jainism, Charvaka, I think there's like 11 philosophies in total, and the majority are Astika. So they're foundationalist, you could say, as opposed to non-foundationalist. Which is to say, so Neurath's boat, and you can see that it also relates to the ship of Theseus, which you're probably thinking about as well, which is like this identity question, which is that if you replace every part of a ship, does it remain the same ship once literally every part has been paired or replaced or whatever? So what I'm trying to say is that if you take the Buddha's raft parable, and you take this idea that maybe commands and adverbs predate nouns, where I'm trying to go with this is like maybe the correct end of searching or of inquiry, of philosophical inquiry, should be not truth, as Socrates seems to presuppose or pre-assume, nor knowledge, which is what John Dewey, the pragmatist philosopher that I mentioned earlier, advocates, that a byproduct of philosophical investigation, what he calls competent inquiry, is knowledge. And I'm saying, what if the true end of philosophy is a methodology, which is essentially an adverb? So it's neither an abstract noun, nor is it a more concrete noun, nor is it an adjective. It's something more like better, which is an adverb, basically. And so, in other words, it's a way of doing something, being something, or saying something in the world. And so, and I, by methodology, I literally mean, how do we live? And this is what Tolstoy says, that science, at least science without further levels of interpretation, does not give us, which is instructions on how to live. This does go back to Socrates in some sense, and to the pre-Socratics, also to Plato and Aristotle. This question of eudaimonia, what is the good way to live? And the Stoics ask this, and the Epicureans ask this. And so that's where I got to today, which is that where all of this is coming together for me is that it may not be that the point of inquiry is to arrive at an opinion, at the truth, at just having knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but rather a way, it's knowing how to do something. And so I think I'm going to leave it there. That's all very new. I could also talk about Nietzsche's contrast between good and bad and good and evil, because I think he's making a similar distinction about, but that's going to take us into another territory about how concrete things are and when value judgments come in. So I'm going to look at the chat and see what we say. Hang on. Yeah, sorry, Ryan. I just got onto. Okay, that was a compliment. Sorry, I just had to get a few things off my chest there, really. So, am I a determinist? It's a good question. I don't know if I have a strict answer to that question. Is there a question? Is there a reason why the glass is there? And I am very much interested in having two-way conversations. Sorry, I just kind of had a bit of a morning where I was like, I wanted to, put some thoughts out there and get them out before I got entangled into other things. Because as you can probably see, I tend to confuse myself as well. Yes. Okay. So you're saying everything in the universe happens from previously existing causes. This is a really important point. That is one of the core teachings of Buddhism, which is it is this thing about it's not just dependent arising. Dependent arising is a subset of something called this, that conditionality, as Brasington puts it. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi calls it specific conditionality. And yeah. So it's a really hard question because I don't have like a strong opinion on the question of free will. It's something that I've kind of gone back and forth on over the years, which is why like sometimes I'm like, oh, it definitely has to be, this network of dependencies. And clearly if we could just understand them all, then we would understand what the outcome is going to be. And at other times I've thought, no, it's got to be more random than that. And now I don't have a strong view because I have kind of vacillated between these for a long time. And the question of determinism, I think it's important to say, like, in the understanding of dependent origination, it's almost like we want to see causality in everything, but actually, and that's for good reason, because certain things that we care about, like if I drop the glass, will it break? That seems to have a pretty clear causal order, sequential order and causal order. And also, like, if I say this to this person, are they going to be pissed off with me? That seems to have a quite clear causal implications as well. And I think that those kind of questions of causality get less and less useful as we go more and more into nature. So basically, if we're looking at, does the seed cause the tree? Like already you're in all these kind of problematic territories, because it's like all these, within biology, there's all these really complex interdependencies, and it's really hard to say which one came first. Did this cause this? Did that cause that? Or is it like in this incredibly complex network of very complicated dependencies? And so I think it's almost like what I would say is that I don't think I'm a determinist in the sense that most people mean it. Like I think causal thinking is very useful in certain places, like especially when you're doing stuff physically in the world or in the social realm. They're both like thinking causally, and what caused this and what will happen if I do this are just critically important. When it comes to philosophy or the sciences, like it starts to break down fairly quickly. Like maybe you have it in physics, and then kind of if you do, kind of think about this Baconian structure of the sciences where, well, he thinks theology is at the top, but maybe we now have this idea that physics is at the top or at the bottom, depending on how you look at it. And it's the closest to what we call matter or whatever. And then on top of that, there's maybe chemistry, and then biology on top of that. And, on many further removes, you end up in sociology and anthropology and philosophy and literature and all that kind of stuff. I think what I'm thinking is, like, at the moment is that even physics, like, whether this strict causal determinist stuff really applies is a kind of open question, maybe with the Einsteinian revolution kind of stuff. But also that the further up the stack you get, that, like, if we are going to call it a stack, then the less tenuous, or the more tenuous, I forgot what tenuous means. The more tenuous, the less likely that seems to me. So yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get to have a two-way conversation, Ryan. I did want to have that. And if you would like to ask any questions, I didn't really do a live kind of live one today, taking the live questions, but in general, I'm very open to that. So I will leave this video up on YouTube. I'm going to post this on, as I said, I'll leave it on YouTube. I'm going to post it on YouTube with a series of show notes that'll give you a way of looking at a little bit more of what I'm thinking about and working on. And you can also, like, if you would like to have a more two-way conversation, or even a call, or on Twitch, I would love to schedule that. This kind of 1 hour slot is mainly just me talking about what I've been thinking about recently. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm going to just post the YouTube channel on here. If you're watching this on YouTube, then there's not a great deal of point of that, because you will already see it. But if you're watching on YouTube, the other thing is I am trying to continue this work. And if you would like to support it, which is basically, I'm trying not to do ads, trying not to do a second. Well, I'm going to have to probably get a job soon anyway. But I'm trying to do more of this work and make it available for free. So if you would like to support that effort, or if you would like to, keep up with what I'm doing, the place where I'm posting literally everything that I think is important related to the kind of original thinking that I'm doing is on Patreon. And so it would be great to have support from you there. Or else you can visit my YouTube channel. And I'm also very open to the kinds of conversations that were requested in the chat. So I'm sorry that I didn't get around to seeing your message until quite late. And I hope that does not discourage you from reaching out in the future. I would love to hear from you. Please comment on this video, or DM me on Twitter, or get in touch on Twitch. I would love to speak to anyone who's interested. And thanks so much for watching. And I will be back here next Tuesday at this time. I'm trying to do a weekly live stream. And until next time, I will see